And thank you all so much for joining our High Desert Academy event today. This is how to build a beaver dam, and I'm so excited to learn alongside you with my colleague Jefferson Jacobs. And so with that, I will let Jefferson take it from here. Jefferson, you're on mute.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for tuning in today to this talk titled How to Build a Beaver Dam. When you hear about humans building beaver dams, you might have pictured it requiring an unusual level of commitment or special physically adapted volunteers. But rest assured, while our volunteers are especially committed, luckily, no actual chewing or reconstructive dentistry is required to build a dam. So nearly every time I talk with people about building dams, the first question I usually get is, why are you building beaver dams? Don't beaver do that? And really they are right, but the answer isn't as simple as it may seem. So before we get into how to build a beaver dam, I want to spend a good deal of the presentation talking about why we should build a beaver dam. To answer that why question, I want to go over 4 main points. Sadly, in a 20-minute presentation, there's lots of little exciting details that I may have to leave out. So I really welcome all your questions at the end of the presentation. Or welcome you to join us on any ONDA restoration trip, where I can definitely be counted on to talk about all of these topics ad nauseum. Today, though, I want to go over a quick review of beaver's role in the ecosystem, look at beaver activities through the lens of climate change, and then I want to talk about beaver in an ecological, historical context. Finally, I'll talk about ONDA's specific beaver-based restoration strategy, and then that's where it'll finally make sense to talk about how to build a beaver dam. Okay, Beaver Ecology 101. Beaver are what is referred to as a keystone species, just like that top block in an old Roman arch. The whole system depends on that keystone. If that stone is removed, the whole arch collapses. In the case of beaver, the arch is the unique ecosystem that they support. The way the beavers support that ecosystem arch is by being ecosystem engineers. Beaver, as ecosystem engineers, need to maintain this arch ecosystem to survive themselves, and then it also ends up supporting plants and animals that have grown to depend on it. But to maintain that arch, beaver need water. Beaver can help control when and where water flows through the landscape by building dams, which not only provide them deep water to escape predators, step 1, don't die, but also irrigates dry land to grow the right plant species that they need for food and building materials. But as that close, convenient vegetation is harvested, beavers dig channels and canals through the valley floor to reach more distant vegetation safely, which also irrigates more and more land, creating suitable growing conditions for yet more vegetation. And you can start seeing how all this can have impacts back and forth, how everything really depends on everything else, and how it requires beaver maintaining the system in a dynamic way. It's also important to point out that there are more things going on in beaver habitat than I have time to get into in this talk. And it's important to admit that we don't even really know exactly all of the marvelous things beaver in their habitat are truly doing. So I represented those acknowledgements with some of these question marks. But what we do know is that you can't have an arch without all the pieces. And that arch has to include the real expert, the ecosystem engineers in that keystone role, to keep it all in balance. All this works together so well, and the resulting habitat supports so many different plants and animals because all the pieces, all the components of this system have been co-evolving and depending on each other and collaborating and perfecting the system for literally millions of years. Now, think of this, in dry ecosystems like Eastern Oregon and the Great Basin, water resources only cover about 2% of the landscape, and yet more than 80% of the animal species there depend on those wet landscapes for survival. With that context in mind, you can really see the outsized, disproportionately high importance of beaver maintained habitat. Okay, now that we've talked that first point about how beaver habitat can't exist without beaver, and how and why so many wildlife species benefit from living with beaver, let's talk about beaver in light of climate change. Since I can't take you all out to show you beaver habitat right now, I built this virtual one. It provides a top view here and a cutaway view here. You can see all the vegetation that beaver are farming, and some cut and some regrowing, some still standing, dams and water all over the place, including here soaked into the ground. This is primo beavertopia. So what's climate change going to do to Eastern Oregon? Well, air and water temperatures will increase. Overall precipitation may decrease. Precipitation will fall less often as snow and more often as larger episodic rain events that may result in periods of drought punctuated by flooding. Fires will be more frequent, bigger, hotter, and the fire season will get longer. And all of this, of course, is driven by increases in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, like carbon dioxide. So what do beavers do about heat? Well, those moist conditions that they maintain are great for fast-growing leafy shade trees. Mature deciduous riparian habitat along a creek can reduce stream temperatures more than 6 degrees Celsius, while climate change is only predicted to increase stream temperatures by about 3 degrees by 2080. And even though Corinne has you all on mute, I can hear you all saying, but don't beaver eat trees? Yes, they do eat trees, but they also build dams with them. And these dams force water underground, where it's actively cooled and released further downstream like a spring. When water comes out of a spring, it's nice and cold. And we're talking about lots of water here, not just the water that you see in the dams, behind the dams. We're talking up to 20 or 30 million gallons of water banked underground by a single beaver family. So picture continuous chains of beaver colonies on a creek, and you can appreciate the potential impact. So really, sometimes the best way for a tree to cool a creek is to be chopped down by a beaver. When there's a drought, as the creek levels drop, those millions of gallons of cold water that beavers have banked underground keeps the vegetation alive and trickles back into the stream to keep it flowing. To illustrate what happens during floods, let's look at a cutaway view of a non-beaver stream here on the left and a beaver stream here on the right. To picture just one of several ways beaver habitat helps dampen flooding effects, picture using a garden hose. To make the hose spray, you press your thumb over the end. It allows you to shoot the water further and move dirt and rocks around. If a flood comes down that narrow, deep eroded channel, it's squeezing all that water into a tight space. That's just like having your thumb on the end of the hose, giving an extra power and speed to erode the system further. And sadly, also for these dry systems, that water is just shot through and is gone, it's just a drainage ditch. However, if you take that same volume of water and you have the beaver dam spread it out over the adjacent floodplains as the creek rises, its power is diffused. Having all that space to flood into is just like taking your thumb off of the hose. And there's all that vegetation to catch the nutritious sediments and slow things down further. And since the water sits on the landscape longer, it can soak into the ground and be banked and cooled for later release, turning that episodic availability of water into a benefit during droughts. Fire. All right, this is a picture of beaver habitat after the Sharps fire in a dry sagebrush area of Idaho. And check out how the beaver habitat didn't burn. But the downstream non-beaver riparian habitat did. Beaver habitat can help as natural fire breaks, but also serve as refugia for plants and animals during the fire. Those surrounding areas will be able to recover a whole lot better. And then finally, in relation to atmospheric carbon contributing to the greenhouse effect, beaver can help with that too. By burying sticks and roots and woody debris that grow prolifically in their habitat, beavers store the carbon that those trees sucked out of the atmosphere. They can do that, and it'll be stored for hundreds and even thousands of years. And they do such a great job that if beavers move into a landscape, they can increase that landscape's carbon storage up to 35 times. So sometimes the best way for a tree to fight climate change is to be cut down by a beaver. So why isn't Oregon, the beaver state, a beavertopia, reaping the benefits of beaver awesomeness? In a word, hats. This here is a felted beaver top hat. This is not what they are. This is what people usually picture, or like a Daniel Boone kind of hat, but this is what we're talking about. Felted beaver top hat. Beaver pelts apparently are really great for making hats. The fur trade supplying the demand for beaver pelts was so ruthless for hundreds of years that the original colonists quickly trapped out essentially all the beaver on the east half of North America. So in an effort to protect their last remaining abundant trapping grounds in the 1820s, the Hudson's Bay Company intentionally trapped out, killed off essentially all the beaver in the Columbia River watershed and a little bit beyond too. The idea was to create a dead zone to discourage American trappers from trapping their way into Western Canada. The Hudson's Bay trappers were so effective, it really only took them a couple of years to trap hundreds of thousands of beavers out of thousands of miles of creeks. So if we return to our virtual beaver habitat again and add in our little ecosystem mini arch with beaver as the keystone, we can move forward through history from pre-1800s all the way to the present and track how it all changes. Keep an eye on that arch and on the habitat. So before the beaver were trapped out thousands of miles of streams, their habitat and ecosystem arch looked like this. Diverse plant and animal populations were supported, and those resources were also key to the survival of local indigenous people living there. But then the beaver are removed. And very quickly, actually, things begin to change. We know this from the detailed descriptions in the journals of the very trappers killing off the beaver, who noted that within just a couple of years after beaver were removed, that dams were no longer maintained and the ponds were draining. As a result of this, there was less water underground. The canals filled in. We lose yet more water. And you'll notice that the vegetation has been increasingly drying out and dying. As we lose more and more components of the system, we lose all that ability to have all the different parts interact and benefit each other. And by this point, we've really lost a lot of what made this area something that you would call beaver habitat. Although it's still green and has water, it's much more challenging for this landscape to support wildlife or indigenous people. Right about this point in history is when the pioneers started showing up on the scene to settle land in the Oregon Territory. They found these wide, comparatively fertile, recently drained beaver valleys that were way better to farm and ranch on than the surrounding arid upland areas. And so to make these areas even more convenient for agriculture, those remaining streams were often straightened and moved to the side of valleys. Remaining woody vegetation was often eaten by cattle or left high and dry by moving the creek or plowed out of the way to make fields. Without anything to hold the eroded, straightened creek's bank together, you get that thumb on the hose situation, and the creek quickly erodes further down to bedrock. At this point, we aren't even losing parts of the ecological arch, we're kind of losing the geologic foundation that's built on top of. And because the creek is now way below this surrounding valley bottom, it serves as a drain for the surrounding landscape, further drying it out. And so over 100 years later, when beaver are finally able to try and start repopulating many areas in Eastern Oregon, they come back to a landscape that is basically unrecognizable to them. Creeks that run dry with hardly any of the right types or amounts of vegetation in many places. A lot of places, their arch is gone. So even though in the original description of the arch, I showed it as collapsed with all the pieces at the bottom, that's kind of a best case scenario. In reality, in a lot of systems, many of those pieces are just now completely missing. In some cases, it may look like some of those pieces are still present, but in reality, they aren't really actually the right pieces. They're the wrong species of plants to eat, or not enough trees for building good dams. And I could give lots of examples of how you could have not quite right beaver habitat, but I think you can see where this is going. It's not really leading to that beautiful ecological arch co-evolved millions of years in the making. It's resulting in, at best, a Frankenstein arch, a Frankenarch. These are the kind of areas where you may see signs of beaver occasionally, or where they may try and make a dam every few years, but generally aren't able to survive for even a whole season. This Frankenarch concept hopefully lets you see how the mere presence of beaver does not actually indicate legitimate, meaningful beaver habitat. Add to that the fact that trapping is still ongoing and beaver are officially listed by Oregon as a pest species, allowing landowners to kill them without restrictions or reporting requirements, and you can see that beavers have an uphill battle. So let's talk about that next bullet point, beaver-based restoration and ONDA's role in recovering these systems. The whole driving strategy behind ONDA's riparian restoration efforts is not actually trying to restore creeks ourselves. There's no way humans are going to rebuild and maintain all of those arches on thousands of miles of creeks. And why should we when we can partner with beaver? They do the best job anyhow. But with things so out of whack, they do need a little help to get things started. So ONDA's restoration goal is to find places where we can try and provide some specific critical missing arch pieces. Again, even though we can't do all the arch building and maintaining ourselves, there are definitely a few things that we actually are particularly good at that can contribute meaningful arch pieces. One of those things we're good at is building Beaver Dam analogs, BDAs. These are temporary biodegradable structures that ONDA uses to raise the water tables just enough to support the planting or recovery of high densities of thousands of specific beaver supporting trees and shrubs. The idea here is merely to jumpstart the repair process, to just get it over the threshold to the point where there's enough pieces of the arch back in place that beaver can take over and be left alone to do what they do better than anything else. We're building that arch and creating a dynamic system that they and so many species, including humans, benefit from. So before we go much further, I'm going to go out of my comfort zone and try to do a little poll. I just want to see how many folks that are listening have been on trips or built dams with us. And this should just take about 30 seconds. You just need to click or tap your screen to show that. And, oh boy. All right. Oh, good. A lot of folks haven't built Beaver Dam analogs with us yet. That'll be fun. And no, do I have to get wet? That's actually one of my favorite options. No, you don't actually have to get wet. There are lots of jobs to do that don't include getting wet. And but since we usually do this in July and August, it's so lovely to stand in the creek and actually cool off. All right, thank you very much. We'll store that for posterity. Great. And I don't know why I can't do my mouse. All right. There we go. Sorry about that. There we go. All right, so now we can talk about actually building these Beaver Dam analogs, or BDAs. Now you know why we're building beaver dams. As I said earlier, we build them because we want beaver back as a keystone species in our stream systems because of all the amazing things that they do, and because those systems are currently in such a degraded state that beaver can't get the process underway in many places on their own yet. So BDAs are tools not used only by ONDA, they're used by lots of restoration practitioners for lots of different reasons. But what I'm gonna go over is just how and why ONDA uses them as part of our particular restoration strategy. So as a tool for restoration, what do we use BDAs for? Again, they're just temporary structures, and that's important, built of local materials that are entirely biodegradable. We're not thinking we're solving problems purely by doing nothing else other than building BDAs. They're typically built in clusters, not as standalone individuals. This BDA, for example, is part of a cluster of 5 BDAs spread out on a 1/4 mile long stretch of creek. And ONDA uses the BDAs to temporarily raise water levels to support the establishment and recovery of the right kinds of riparian vegetation. So what are the steps in building a BDA? Well, once you've determined a good site, actually building a BDA is at its most basic, basically a 2.5 step process. This video of a BDA we built just downstream of that one that I showed in the previous slide that was all flooded. The creek dries out again before it gets here, but in the spring it gets wet again. We're not just building a BDA in a field. But to build a BDA, the first step is to use a hydraulic post pounder to install a line of posts across the creek bed. The posts are untreated wood, pounded at least several feet into the ground, and these serve as anchors for the BDA. On this project, we partnered with a youth conservation group called Heart of Oregon back in 2018. But usually it's ONDA volunteers running the machinery. After the posts are in, we add a few rocks to prevent water from eroding a hole underneath the dam that we'll build. Depending on conditions, you can add the rocks and dirt before or during or after the next step. But that next and final step in this case is to weave in whatever green live materials that you have on hand to the desired dam height. Typically we use willow, but sometimes that isn't available. So we use juniper, even lodgepole branches. We also put in sticks perpendicular to the post line weave. This helps reduce scouring out of the stream bed downstream of the BDA caused by any floodwaters pouring over the top. That would make the poles tip over and wash away and you lose the BDA. And that's all there is to it. That's how you build a Beaver Dam analog. I really hope that those of you who answered the poll that you haven't built a BDA with us yet or haven't joined us on a trip yet will come out with us on one of our next work trips. How can you do that? How do you get involved? Well, under the current circumstances, we're not exactly sure when our field volunteer season will be able to restart this year, but we will have updates posted as soon as they come available at onda.org, or if you're a member through emails. Our calendar of restoration trips is posted here at onda.org/trips. And these are the opportunities for helping out do things, not only building BDAs and planting trees, but removing barbed wire or building trails. But since we don't currently know when we'll be getting back to that sort of group activity, please consider taking this opportunity to become an ONDA member today. Or you can renew your membership or even make a special donation through our website at onda.org/give. And don't forget to mark your calendars for the final presentation in the High Desert Academy series, How to Use Your Voice for Public Lands, with Jeremy on the 20th. And you can find that link to the talk at onda.org as well. And now I'm going to hand the controls back over to Corinne so she can go through some of the questions folks sent in during the presentation. And thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jefferson. We do have questions still coming into the chat box. So if you have a question that you haven't yet sent in, feel free to continue typing to me. I'll get to them as quickly as we can. So we got a few variations of the same question, which is an excellent one, which is how do you decide where to work and what needs to be done, and where are we currently working based on those criteria?
Yeah, great. So how and where? Sometimes I get talking and I get excited about one question. Where are we working? We do a lot of work right now in the John Day River Basin. One of the places we work in particular is Pine Creek Conservation Area, which is near Clarno on the John Day. And this is about a 30,000 acre conservation parcel that's owned and managed by the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs in cooperation with Bonneville Power Administration. And actually that picture behind the questions slide there, that is a natural beaver dam that was triggered through this exact process. It's my favorite story. You can walk along the creek and see where we put in beaver dam analogs and walk further down the creek, and then the beaver that were trying to make a go of it there eventually saw our dams and the water was enough and the vegetation recovered enough that they were like ready to take over, and they did. But it's also still a little bit of that Franken arch, and so the beavers aren't able to survive year after year after year because there's not quite enough vegetation to do that yet, but we're working on it. So John Day is a big concentration area. We have projects going on at Cottonwood Canyon State Park as well on the lower John Day, where we're actively building beaver dams. And the South Fork Crooked drainage is a big active area where we've had big projects going on there since 2015. So those are some of the big areas, but we work all over Eastern area, Oregon, Malheur National Forest, everywhere. And then how do we decide? You got to cut me off, Corinne, if I get talking too long. How do we decide? That's a great question. And there's all sorts of crazy models that are really amazing and informative that people have come up with to decide where beavers should be on the landscape. And they're great for a large scale, but it doesn't tell you so often what we want to know with the tools that we have developed. So ONDA is actually developing our own model to make decisions about where exactly to work, and it's called Beaverhoods. And that model, it lets you look at a specific reach of the creek, and we look for areas that have about 12 acres around the creek that are less than 5 feet above the creek. So it allows us to have beaver flooded out or us to get down to the water table for planting. And then from there, we look at some different characteristics as how much water there is and that sort of thing. Right now, there's so many opportunities to do work. We're not restricted by places to work so much as just getting out to all of them and doing the work there, though.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being very thorough with that. I think this is excellent because we got a lot of questions along that line. So the next question is also one that I've gotten already probably 5 different ways here, which is what do we do after the BDA is complete? Do we bring beaver back in? Do we target building BDAs, places where we know that beaver already exist? And then the second part of that is how do we work with the landowners then? Do we convince them to bring beavers onto their property or to not trap them? And what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are very few places that we work where beaver aren't on their own trying to get actively back to. So they're just kind of throwing their bodies at these Frankenarch areas and either getting trapped or killed off or starved or eaten by predators. It's pretty grim. So we haven't encountered a situation where we've needed to actively bring beaver in. Unless it's a closed system in the Great Basin or something like that. And we actually have a project being developed in a system like that, where if we restore the plants, we'll have to bring beaver in. But in general, they're just there really waiting and eyeing our progress expectantly. So there's that. Landowners, there's a lot of potential impacts of having beaver on your property, and a lot of those are really great and positive. There's a lot of perceived issues or difficulty in dealing with some of those beaver impacts, like flooding or plugged culverts and stuff. And so it's really important to make sure that any landowner that we're working with is fully aware of what's potentially going to happen. But right now, there's only one organization that I know of on the east side that is providing non-lethal ways to deal with beaver conflicts, and that's BeaverWorks Oregon, and they can help landowners. But the first step is definitely trying to pick places like conservation areas like this, state parks, different areas where we can create that beaver habitat in areas that won't have a conflict right off the bat.
Awesome. And do you know if there's any current legislative efforts to protect beavers from hunting and trapping? And do we have agreements with landowners that if we're working with them, that they won't engage in those practices?
Yeah, first one is easy. All the landowners that we work with are total beaver believers and are behind this effort 100%. So we don't have necessarily written agreements, but I think they'd rather cut off their arm than trap or kill a beaver on their property. And then the current legislative efforts, there have been in the past, and there's definitely a real growing movement to accomplish that. Beaver trapping has been ruled out in some national forest areas and even parts of BLM lands to help restoration. But there's this growing realization now that we need to stop killing off beaver, and they're not as bad as people think.
Excellent. So someone asked a question about what native plants and trees are ideal for beaver habitat in Eastern Oregon.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely regional and even family specific sometimes as to what beaver like to eat and use and such. And you'll see them chew some things because they need to keep their teeth from growing. They grow continuously, and they grow so fast that they actually can grow back into their palate and spear and kill the beaver if they don't chew enough. So just if you see beaver chewing on something doesn't mean that's good food. What they really like to eat are things like aspen, cottonwood, and certain types of willow on the east side. Less like in a lot of places where we work, not so much the alder or even red osier dogwood. They'll chew them and they can eat them and everything. But like if you look at an alder or a juniper or something like that, it's just got that dry bark. It's kind of like eating a spoonful of flaxseed or something like that, whereas cottonwood and willow and that sort of thing are more like a leafy salad. But that's also just their winter stuff. During the summer, they'll eat grasses and forbs and water lilies and cattail rhizomes and stuff, all sorts of different green living things. But it really can depend on the drainage and the family, because a lot of these skills are learned. So the longer a family has lived in a drainage, the more they understand and gain an appreciation for the different foods that are available there. So if they're coming from someplace weird, they might be in a land of plenty, but not realize it. So.
Great. One question was kind of along a similar vein, which was about the material used for our Beaver Dam analogs. Someone asked that these projects, as you described, use primarily wood and willows. And someone asked if it would be so much easier for us to just use rock and build up a dam using hardened materials. Why don't we take that approach?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. One, it's funny that the city of Gresham actually did a really neat study. They got excited about beavers that were taking over their water treatment areas, and they actually found out that beaver dams were doing a better job of cleaning the water than their water treatment facilities were. And so then this great lady who worked City of Gresham walked up and down the creek and did all these great studies looking at human-made structures, rock structures, and cement and different things, and looked at temperatures and stuff. And it's just, if it looks like a dam, it doesn't mean that it operates in the same way as a beaver dam. So beaver dams cool the water and they let stuff filter through. Fish migration, little baby fish are able to get through all those little nooks and crannies and everything. So, all those question marks in the beaver dam arch, there's so much going on there that we don't know exactly how it all works. But if we're trying to make it look as much like a beaver dam as possible, then hopefully we're recreating that, and studies show that so far. The other thing is that sometimes if you're using rock and big solid things and going all Army Corps engineer on it, that's not such a temporary thing. And that's all we need, is just a temporary raising of water levels. We're not trying to change the geology of the creek itself. And finally, if you're just using these rocks and sticks that people can carry and relatively simple tools, we just get a bunch of volunteers and they come out and we build these things really easily, whereas we don't need big heavy machinery and stuff like that. So it's the best mimic nature and ease of building, and providing those ecosystem arch pieces best.
Excellent, thank you so much. The funny thing about the citation that you're talking about in Gresham, I actually used to work doing river restoration in the Sandy Basin, and partnered with them on restoring beaver in Beaver Creek. And so
yes,
kind of a funny throwback to my past career as well. And on that note, someone else commented in that there are current efforts underway in the Willamette Valley through a proposal to the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission requesting that beaver trapping cease on federal lands. That wouldn't impact private land, but apparently there is a proposal going through.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and kind of on that similar, like, how do we coordinate? There have been a couple questions of who we partner with to coordinate our projects. So someone asked if we're coordinating with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Fish Passage Task Force to ensure that.
Yeah, so there's various different things that we do to kind of stay involved with this and hopefully provide a vote in favor of beaver. Definitely Fish Passage Task Force is really important because any structure that you build in a creek has to allow fish to get by. And that's another reason why to build the dams the way that I was describing. But there's also ODF&W has a beaver working group, and we attend those meetings, and that's very interesting. Different professionals from all over the state come and discuss things. And then there's the recently started Beaver Coalition, which we work with closely now, and then just other local scientists and organizations as well. It's kind of a grassroots beaver nerd effort right now, but we're rising up.
Awesome. I love that grassroots collaboration. So there have been a few questions along the lines of if we have encountered any resistance to beaver reintroduction, and kind of how do we coordinate with landowners to mitigate any potential damage that that beaver might cause.
Yeah, I mean, there's just been having beaver listed as a pest species in Oregon, it kind of predisposes people to worry about beaver and what they could do on their property. And in reality, it's pretty easy to be proactive and address a lot of those concerns. For example, culvert and plugging and the flooding that can result from that. Beavers love to plug up culverts. There's these things called beaver deceivers, where basically a drain pipe that you set at a certain level that lets water go through and doesn't let the pond rise above a certain level. And so you can mitigate that. A lot of people worry because, you know, their decorative trees get eaten out of their yard or something like that. And that's an easy fix there as well, where you can cage them, and there are certain paints, kind of sandy paints that you can put on them as well. So in terms of mitigating things, there are definitely a large range of solutions better than trapping them out. And trapping them out is like bailing the ocean with a Dixie cup anyways. It's only kind of sadder because when you actually trap out beaver, there's so many waiting in the wings really to come back into that habitat. It's just a matter of time before they try to come back. So it's kind of better to work with them and reap those benefits.
Great. So we have a handful of remaining questions, and I think we'll just kind of keep going through all of them. One person asked, what do we do to maintain our beaver dam analogs, especially knowing that there might be seasonal flooding or streams that blow them out?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. We definitely keep an eye on them because, you know, theoretically, we're trying to temporarily raise those water levels to establish plants. So I'm trying to keep the water just at that root bottom, just nice for long enough for the roots to get going, and then the roots can grow down. And if the water level falls down, then it's okay. The roots will chase after it. So if I get a sudden blowout or something like that on a beaver dam analog, then it can kill off a lot of work that we put in. So doing regular checks, and a lot of people visit these areas and will report back to me. But luckily, since they're such a simple system, it's really easy to adjust them. If there's a gigantic flood, 100-year flood or something like that, you just put the BDA back in once the water goes down enough. They're pretty, they can be really low maintenance. So the other thing is that since we're building them out of green materials, like if you build them with willow and stuff, sometimes those willows will actually start growing. Actually, when we pound in those posts, a lot of time we'll drill a hole through the bottom of it and stick a willow in there. And then when you pound the post in, the willow bends up and you're actually planting a willow while you're putting in that post. And so it's kind of this living dynamic thing all in of itself, and it kind of adapts and such. So yeah, maintenance hasn't really been an issue, and we've installed, I can't even keep track now of how many we've installed. So yeah.
Awesome. That's really exciting to hear. Someone asked, where did you get our stream temperature reduction information, and maybe some other citations for data that you mentioned in your presentation?
Yes, actually, since this is a nerdy grassroots level effort, I actually put together a list of citations that Corinne and Lace will be sending around to everybody that listens today. And included in that is this great long-term study that was done in the John Day and the Grand Ronde rivers, and they did a lot of really cool modeling that showed that. So that citation, you will actually get that after the talk.
Yes, we will send that out tomorrow. So we'll send out this recording and also links to more information. So there have been a couple of questions about what other states are doing on beaver restoration or BDA building. And do you know of other states working on this in the same way?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a patchwork. And so a lot of the folks, you may have seen a photograph, their photo credit from Joe Wheaton. There's a bunch of folks out of Utah that are doing great work, and up through Idaho and Montana, Nevada, Arizona, Northern California. It's definitely a Western states thing, Washington, all of that area. What's been really different is the permitting process that allows this. And there was a question earlier that I don't think I quite answered about like support or something along those lines. And it's been interesting. Different states have approached this different ways. Some see beaver as a great partner, and others take a much more cautious, do no harm approach. There have been a lot of great, super awesome silver bullet ideas for solving riparian problems that have turned out to be horrible in the past. And so ONDA's done a bunch of projects where we've torn out the bad idea of 2 decades ago and installed our new idea. And so I think there's a lot of cautiousness when looking at these kinds of things, to not just be condoning the next bad idea. But luckily, there's so much great research showing that this is a great idea. The Bridge Creek on the John Day, there's a paper that in the citations that talks about that. Long-term monitoring showing how BDAs and beaver dams don't obstruct fish passage and really increase productivity and such. So, but it's a patchwork, and every state I think is kind of looking at the other state as to what they're doing. So
awesome. So I'll have one short question and then one fun question.
okay.
So short question, what is the best time of year to build a BDA?
Yeah, well, it depends what river you're working on and what fish are present. So There are no short questions. But like on the John Day, because of the natural history of fish and what they're doing when, mid-July through end of August is when you're allowed to work in a creek, but that is slightly different depending where you're working on and when and what fish are doing what in those locations. And then in some areas, it doesn't matter at all if there aren't protected fish or there's not water there at that time, but you always have to check. If you're going to do this, you always have to check with your local fishery biologists with the state to make sure you really fully understand it. So.
Excellent. So last question, which is a fun one, which is why I saved it. Can you tell us maybe your favorite success story of beaver restoration?
Oh yeah, well, it really is. You know, this creek, and that's why I put it on the questions slide there, because it was the first area at Pine Creek, that Confederated Tribes land, where we started building BDAs in 2015. And by building those BDAs, we got to see the progression of going from very unhappy looking creek through, you know, sediment building up behind those dams, and very quickly, and the vegetation expanding, and there had always been some beaver trying to make it there. And then over time, on a BDA building trip, we were out there, and it was like lunchtime or something. We were like, oh, let's go down and check to see, I think there's beavers doing something downstream. And we literally walked from that dry section of creek down, and then we see like a BDA that had sediment behind it. And then we get to the next one, and then there's like water and sediment. We get to the next one, and there's beaver chew, and then like a beaver dam. And then we come around the corner, and there's like ducks fly up, and migrating songbirds singing and everything. And literally there's a family of otters swimming in the pond catching fish. And it's like, oh, it was just the perfect moment. And it just was this whole culmination. And I think very rewarding for the people that, you know, were banging posts and weaving in this dry creek bed upstream, you know, thinking, yeah, sure, this is a great idea. What's this going to do? And it's, you walk down forward in time, and then you see this and everything. So it doesn't take much to keep me going, but that's definitely one of my happy moments.
Well, that certainly sounds joyous, and I'm so glad that we can now go back and see all of the rewards of our efforts over the time that we've spent doing this restoration work. So with that, I will say I learned a lot. I hope you all did as well. I did drop Jefferson's email into the chat box, and we will send that follow-up to everyone tomorrow with this recording and links to additional resources. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you at our next High Desert Academy event next Wednesday at 4 p.m. With our coworker, Jeremy. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone.